Hello, class. We have now reached chapter 2 of the Gospel of Matthew, and so this lecture will cover that chapter. And we look at verse number 1. We see the arrival of the Magi. Let's read. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east, and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. After Jesus' birth, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, looking for the one born King of the Jews. In the east, they were looked upon as wise men, these Magi. Possibly, they were well acquainted with the Jewish scriptures by means of the Jewish captives deported to Babylon and Medo-Persia. The prophecy of Daniel 9 would have caused great anticipation for the coming king at this time. It is highly significant that the Magi came to worship the young child. They seemed completely cognizant of the messianic implications of the one born King of the Jews. It is evident these events transpire a considerable time after the birth of Jesus. The Greek word paidion in Matthew 2:11 is used to describe the infant, means young child. And now we see a literal fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Look at these verses 4 through 8. We read, "Gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They said to him, 'In Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written.'" See, this is the Old Testament, by the Old Testament prophet, "And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah. For out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel." Then Herod secretly called the Magi and determined from them the exact time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. And when you have found him, report back to me so that I too may come and worship him." When Herod heard the Magi were looking for the one who has been born King of the Jews, he became troubled. So he gathered the chief priests and scribes of the Jews and asked where the Messiah was supposed to be born. They answered, "Bethlehem of Judea," which indicated the king was to be born out of the tribe of Judah. Thus, Jesus' birth was a literal fulfillment of prophecy. The prophecy is Micah 5:2, Bethlehem of Judea. Then the crafty Herod sends the Magi on their way with the command to report back to him with their findings. We see the Magi worship Jesus. They find him. Verse 9 through 12. After hearing the king, they went their way, and the star which they had seen in the east went on before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. After coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell to the ground and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi left for their own country by another way. When the Magi have heard leave Herod in Jerusalem and proceed on their way to Bethlehem, the star reappears to guide them to the house where Jesus was. When the Magi find the child king, they respond with worship and present him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Having worshipped the king, the Magi are warned by God not to return to Herod. Thus they withdraw to their own country another way. And then in verses 13 through 15, we see the fulfillment of another prophecy through the means of typology. Let's read here. Now when they had gone, Magi, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him. So Joseph got up and took the child and his mother while it was still night and left for Egypt. He remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet out of the Egypt. And this is what it was. Out of Egypt I call my son. And so here we see another prophecy from the Old Testament. Out of Egypt I call my son. So let's look at the bullets. After the Magi depart, an angel appeared to Joseph and commands him to take the child king and Mary and flee to Egypt. They must stay there until Herod dies. Matthew, in his gospel, states that this was in fulfillment of the prophet Hosea, chapter 11, verse 1. The nation Israel was called God's son in Exodus 4:22. Hosea uses the same terminology as Moses did in Exodus 4:22, God's son, in his prophetic writings in this verse 1 of chapter 11 to refer to the nation of Israel. Since Jesus is the Son of God in the history of the nation Israel as a typical anticipation of the life of the Messiah, that which God accomplished with the children of Israel going to Egypt and then their return in the Exodus is confirmed in his workings with his son. Therefore, Matthew looks at the flight of Jesus into Egypt as a purposeful fulfillment of Hosea 11:1 in a typological fashion. So we see Jesus fulfilling the typology here as literally the Son of God, but he is in the same way typologically fulfilling. We see the type-anti-type relationship here of Hosea 11:1 and Matthew as well, chapter 15 of chapter 2, verse 15 of chapter 2. Now we see another prophecy, and we see it fulfilled not literally and not typologically, but it's an analogy from the Old Testament that Matthew uses in the New Testament. So let's read verses 16 and 18. 16, 17, and 18. Then when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he became very enraged and sent and slew all the male children who were in Bethlehem and all its vicinity from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the Magi. Then when what had been spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled, a voice was heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be comforted because they were no more. And so we see now Matthew is using a passage from Jeremiah, and he makes an analogy here in these verses 16 through 18. Let's look at the bullets. While the family of Joseph, Mary, and Jesus is in Egypt, Herod discerns that he was deluded by the Magi, and he becomes very enraged. Well, the Magi was just being obedient. Angel told them to go back to their country, not to go back to Herod. Herod had all the male children, that is, 2 years old and under, in Bethlehem and its vicinity, killed. Matthew states that this is a fulfillment of Jeremiah 31:15, a fulfillment by way of analogy. So let's read the next bullet. Jeremiah, in poetic imagery, describes the entombed Rachel weeping for the Israelites who are being deported to Babylon in the captivity when Nebuchadnezzar had 3 deportations, and these mothers were weeping for their children and their sons. In Jeremiah's time, the statement refers to the weeping of the mothers of Israel as a result of the deportation or death of their children at the time of the Babylonian captivity. Rachel's tomb was near Jerusalem and was considered by many as the mother of the nation. And of course, she was one of the wives of Jacob. Matthew uses Jeremiah 31:15 as an analogy to the situation under Herod, since mothers were again weeping for the loss of their children. And so this is by way of analogy. Next, we read verses 19 through 21, and we see Joseph, Mary, and the child Jesus return from Egypt back to the Promised Land. Matthew 19 reads, "But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, and said, Get up, take the child Jesus and his mother, and go into the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead." That is Herod. So Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and came into the land of Israel. Look at the first bullet again. Joseph was instructed by an angel. This time he was to leave Egypt and to return home to the land of Israel, since Herod had died. Joseph obediently followed the Lord's instruction and came into the land of Israel. This is the only occurrence of the term land of Israel in the New Testament. And it is used here, since it designates the promises and blessings bestowed by God on Jacob and his descendants. And then we have, in verses 22 and 23, another fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, but this time it's Matthew uses it as a summary of basically of several prophets would have something they would not necessarily implicitly stated but implied. So let's look here, a summary. But when he heard when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Then, after being warned by God in a dream, he left for the regions of Galilee and came and lived in a city called Nazareth. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets. That's what I'm saying. This is not, it's plural, not one. So we don't have one specific prophecy that we're looking at here. It's a summary of prophets, not one. He shall be called a Nazarene. And we see here Matthew also making a reference to the Old Testament prophets, but not just one particular prophetic utterance. When Joseph heard that Herod's son was reigning over Judea in place of his father, he feared going into Judea. With this news, Joseph departs for Galilee and dwells in a city called Nazareth. Well, this is, Matthew says, under divine inspiration of the Holy Spirit, that this is a fulfillment of the Old Testament prophets, that he would dwell in Nazareth. For the fourth time in chapter 2, Matthew sees the event here as a prophetic fulfillment of the Old Testament prophets. Let's look at the bullets of that. The Old Testament prophecies of reproach, such as Psalms 22, 6 through 9, Isaiah chapter 53, are being summarized. Pointing to be called a Nazarene was to be spoken of as despicable. It was a pejorative. It was not a positive thing. It was a negative statement. Matthew is pointing to those prophecies in the Old Testament which portray the Messiah as rejected and despised, and claiming their fulfillment here in verses 22 and 23 in the fact that Jesus is reared in Nazareth. Israel's feeling of contempt for their king is indicated by Matthew 2:23 and is established by the entire second chapter of Matthew. And so that concludes this lecture. And